Welcome back to another screencast video with Mr. Koget. We're going to continue working on macromolecules today from our Unit 3 in cells, and we're going to be focusing on proteins today. Let's jump right in. So we have 4 goals that we're going to be trying to accomplish today: to understand what proteins are composed of and what their structure is, to understand why proteins are important and the role they play in the cell, to understand where humans get proteins from, and finally to understand what enzymes are. All right, so our first one, talking about proteins, what they're made of. So proteins actually vary somewhat. So unlike what we saw with carbohydrates, that they have specifically carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, proteins also sometimes contain sulfur and they always contain nitrogen. So they're slightly different from one to the other, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means that they're different. When you've got proteins are made up of many smaller subunits. So the fact that they're made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sometimes sulfur is because there are smaller parts that come together to form bigger parts, which is what we call our proteins. So the first part, I'm going to show you this picture now. This is the structure of an amino acid. An amino acid is the smaller structure that makes up proteins, and I'll show you a picture in a second. What this picture is showing you is that there are it always looks the same in terms of having a carbon here with another carbon bond to it, an oxygen and a hydrogen, a double bond with another oxygen, this hydrogen, this nitrogen on the other side, and hydrogen bonded to that. You can see that those are called the amino group, which is the nitrogen and hydrogens, and the carboxyl group, which is the carbon with the double bonded oxygen and the oxygen and hydrogen. And here, this side chain is what changes, and this is why it's different, and that's why sometimes it might have sulfur and sometimes it's not. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids, and depending on the other parts that are here, it can is what the specific one is, and this can vary. The R can sometimes just be another carbon and a hydrogen and a couple of hydrogens, or it could be a little bit more complicated than that. But to give us the basic understanding of the structure of proteins, we first have to understand this. Then what happens is those start to attach together. So this is one amino acid and another, and you can see that R again there. They're not showing you specifically what it is, but they start to bond together. And we show you over here that we're showing it in a diagram as if it's a circle, and that represents one amino acid, which really represents that whole group that we saw in the previous slide. Now those come together, and we've got our individual amino acids which start to form together. They start to bond together and form a peptide. Peptide is just no specific shape, and they are attached together. But then we get to proteins. Proteins are not only just lots and lots of amino acids, but they have specific shapes, and each specific shape for each specific protein is going to be different. And that's part of what allows for the function of proteins in cells and in our body. We see here, again, their structure can be very complicated, not just the amino acids. And then we see that that's called the primary structure, which is just the list of all the different kinds of amino acids and the folding that it has, but how those folds start to fold together, which is the tertiary structure. And what we'll also see is sometimes you have more than one protein attached together to form the overall protein that's going to cause a specific function, and that's called the quaternary structure. So that gives us a little bit more understanding of how we get to carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, but then also sometimes sulfur in our proteins. And that again explains why these are macromolecules, because you can have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of amino acids coming together to form the proteins. Just something that you might also start to become familiar with and see is this is a computer model of a specific kind of proteins, and this is obviously not even showing us the amino acids that make this up. It's showing us the overall structure that we have here. We can see that the secondary structure is sort of re-represented as if it's sort of that larger, just long line folded in a specific way. And we see that here as well, that it's these larger structures that are attached together. We can see several different individual strands of protein attached together. All right, let's move on to our next goal. And our next goal was to understand why proteins are important and the role they play in the cell. All right, so proteins are molecules that do a couple of different things. They give the cell its shape. So they are the infrastructure to allow it to be a specific shape. They organize the organelles in the cytoplasm. Something we talked about before, that organelles sort of float around in the cytoplasm, but they also do have some structure to them that proteins help with. They help with creating other molecules, and we'll get to that a little bit in a little bit. And they also help to send messages from cell to cell. Proteins will send messages that hit the cell membrane that we'll talk about more in our next unit. Let's move on now to our next goal. Our next goal is to understand where humans get proteins from, excuse me. All right, so we get proteins from a lot of different food that we eat. Meats and fish, cheese, eggs, beans, nuts and seed, hummus, and even a little bit in breads. And that's because all of these foods that we're getting, a lot of them being meat or coming from animals, specifically are high in proteins because muscles are actually made out of protein. So in our body, and you can see this is a diagram here of muscles are made heavily with proteins. And same thing, that's why meat and fish will be high in protein. Eggs, cheese, and are also going to be parts coming from animals that have high in protein. And these are coming from plants more. So that answers our next one. We're going to move on now to our final goal, which is to understand what enzymes are. So if you remember before when we were talking about the functions of proteins, we said that they create other molecules, and that's specific to enzymes. Enzymes are a specific kind of protein that help reactions happen in a cell on a quicker, faster way. So reactions can sometimes be stuff that's happened very, very slowly. They can take days or hours in order for things to happen, or they can happen instantaneously or almost instantaneously, very, very quickly. Enzymes help them happen that quickly. So enzymes will either attach to or have something attached to them that allows a reaction to happen. So for example, when we're drinking milk, we get the sugar from milk, which is called lactose. If you remember ose from our last video, tells us that it's a kind of sugar. When we drink milk, we want to get the sugar and use it. But the sugar itself, lactose, is a little bit complicated for us to use. So this enzyme will bind with the lactose, and we call that a substrate, which is just anything that's going to bind with an enzyme. I'm going to write it up here for you guys so you have it spelled out for you. Substrate will bind with the enzyme, and the enzyme might either attach things together or break things apart. In this case, which is the lactose, it breaks down the lactose into two other kinds of sugar, one of them being glucose, which is the main sugar that our body makes use of. One other thing to note, I'm going to come back to that in a second, there are tons and tons of different kinds of enzymes, hundreds if not tens of thousands actually of enzymes found in our bodies and in the bodies of other organisms. They play a crucial role, which is why proteins are really, really important for us as well. Finally, just a note, enzymes always end in ACE. ACE means that it's an enzyme. So if we think back, we've heard of lactose and lactose intolerance. Lactase would be the enzyme that breaks down lactose. And you may have heard that the reason somebody's lactose intolerant is because their enzymes, lactase, there aren't enough or any at all being created by their body. And that's why they can't break down milk. But ACE in general would be the suffix that is used to describe an enzyme. So if we think, for example, if I said, I need you guys to come up with an enzyme that's going to break down Mr. Koget, you would say Koget ACE, because that would be the enzyme. So in other words, just to understand that ACE is the suffix that we use. I hope that helps us understand a little bit more about proteins, the specific kind of macromolecule in our cell. This is Mr. Koget, and everyone have a wonderful day.